Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Facts channel. Tonight we are stepping into one of the most extraordinary and contradictory worlds in the history of human civilization. The world of the wealthy Victorian. A world of enormous houses and invisible servants, of elaborate dinner parties and strict social rules, of immense wealth and immense hypocrisy, of scientific progress and rigid tradition, of empire and drawing rooms and calling cards and the particular kind of pressure that comes from having everything and being required at all times to appear as though none of it costs you any effort at all. The Victorian era, stretching from the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837 to her death in 1901, was one of the most transformative periods in British history and in the history of the wider world that Britain was busy reshaping through its empire, its industry, and its extraordinary confidence in its own rightness. The wealthy Victorians sat at the top of a society that was being remade beneath them by forces they had often helped to create and did not always understand. The railways that connected their country estates to London were built by capital they had invested and labour they did not perform. The empire that supplied the tea they drank at 4 o'clock and the cotton that made their clothes and the exotic animals in their country house, parks was maintained by soldiers and administrators and the populations of subject peoples whose lives were shaped by decisions made in the drawing rooms and clubs and parliament of a small damp island that had somehow convinced itself it was the centre of the world. And in many ways, for a while, it was. This is a story about what it looked like from inside that centre, about the houses and the meals and the rituals and the clothes and the children and the servants and the rules and the silences and the pleasures of a class of people who lived at the very top of one of the most powerful societies the world had ever seen. If these gentle journeys through history bring you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. And as the night gathers around you, come with me into the Victorian drawing room. Let us begin. The Victorian country house was one of the most complex social machines ever built. To understand the world of the wealthy Victorian, you have to begin with the house. Not a house in the ordinary sense, but something closer to a self-contained village. A working institution of sometimes hundreds of rooms, spread across acres of land, and dependent on the labour of dozens of servants to function for a household of perhaps 8 to 12 family members. The great Victorian country house was the physical expression of wealth and status in a way that nothing else quite matched. You could wear expensive clothes and drive expensive carriages and belong to the right clubs and attend the right events. But to have a country house of real consequence, to have a seat, as the Victorians called it, was to possess something that money alone could not entirely buy. It required land. And land in Victorian England was not simply property. It was identity. It was history. It was the physical embodiment of a family's claim to belong to the class that mattered. The house itself might be genuinely ancient, a Tudor or Jacobean or Georgian structure that had been in the family for generations and that carried in its stones the accumulated weight of family history. Or it might be newly built by a manufacturer or banker who had made a fortune in the Industrial Revolution and who now wished to translate that fortune into the language of landed respectability. Either way, the house said the same thing. We are here. We have always been here. we intend to remain. The architecture of Victorian country houses ranged from the genuinely magnificent to the frankly absurd. The Gothic Revival style, inspired by the medieval architecture of churches and castles, produced houses of extraordinary theatrical ambition that looked more like illustrations from romantic novels than family residences. The Italianate style, inspired by the villas of northern Italy, gave other houses an air of warm Mediterranean sophistication that sat somewhat incongruously in the English countryside. The classical Georgian tradition continued in houses that combined a formal and restrained exterior with interiors of considerable luxury and comfort. Whatever the style, the house announced its owner's aspirations before a visitor had crossed the threshold. The approach was designed to impress. A long drive through landscaped parkland, past lake and woodland, and carefully placed specimen trees led the visitor through a sequence of visual experiences designed to communicate the scale and taste and resources of the family within. By the time the carriage drew up before the front door, the house had already been performing its function for several minutes. The army of servants that kept the Victorian country house running was enormous and largely invisible. The smooth functioning of a great Victorian household depended on the labour of a workforce whose defining characteristic was the requirement to be as unobtrusive as possible. Servants were expected to perform their work invisibly, appearing when needed and disappearing when not, moving through the back passages and service stairs that ran parallel to the grand corridors and main staircases of the house, so that the family and their guests need never witness the labour that sustained the comfort they took for granted. A large country house might employ anywhere from 20 to 50 indoor servants, ranging from the butler at the top of the male servant hierarchy to the scullery maid at the bottom of the female one. The butler was responsible for the wine cellar, the silver, the male servants, and the smooth running of the dining room. He was a figure of considerable dignity, who might be better dressed than many of the tradespeople who came to the back door, and who was addressed by the family with a courtesy that reflected his importance to the household's functioning. The housekeeper occupied the equivalent position among the female servants. She managed the female staff, controlled the household stores, kept the accounts, and maintained the standards of cleanliness and order that the family expected without ever having to request them. Below these two senior figures stretched a hierarchy of specialized roles: the cook who managed the kitchen, and the army of kitchen maids who assisted her, the lady's maid who dressed the mistress of the house and maintained her wardrobe and accompanied her on journeys, the valet who performed the same functions for the master, the footman who served at table and answered the door and carried messages and were chosen partly for their height and appearance, because they were one of the few categories of servant the family and their guests would actually see, the housemaids who cleaned the rooms, laid and lit the fires, and performed the endless physical labour of maintaining a large house in a condition that met the exacting standards of the Victorian elite. The life of a Victorian servant was one of long hours, restricted freedom, rigid hierarchy, and occasional genuine connection with the family they served. They lived in the house, but not of it. They knew its secrets, but were expected to keep them. They were essential to everything the family valued about its life, and they were largely invisible in the record that life left behind. The morning routine of a wealthy Victorian household was an elaborate and unhurried ritual. The day in a wealthy Victorian house began long before the family was aware of it. The housemaids were up before dawn, relaying the fires in the main rooms, sweeping the grates, polishing the hearths, and performing all the cleaning that had to be completed before the family appeared. and the house was required to look as though it maintained itself by magic. The kitchen was already in full production by the time the first family members thought about breakfast, with the cook and her assistants preparing the multiple dishes that a Victorian breakfast was expected to provide. Breakfast for a wealthy Victorian household was not a small meal. It was laid on the sideboard in covered dishes from which family members could help themselves over the course of an hour or more. Kidneys and bacon and sausages and kedgeree and deviled bones and eggs prepared in various ways, and cold meats and toast and marmalade and tea and coffee constituted a morning meal that reflected the Victorian belief that a substantial breakfast was the foundation of a productive day, and that abundance at the table was a form of virtue. The master of the house might breakfast alone if he had a state business to attend to, or join his family in the breakfast room where newspapers would be laid out and the post would have been sorted. The letters that arrived each morning were one of the primary means by which Victorian social life was organized and maintained. Invitations accepted and declined, engagements confirmed, arrangements made, gossip exchanged, family news transmitted, business conducted, and the complex machinery of Victorian social obligation kept turning through the daily exchange of correspondence that required its own considerable time and skill to manage. Victorian clothing was a statement of social position that required hours to achieve. Getting dressed in a wealthy Victorian household was not a simple matter of putting on clothes. It was a performance requiring assistance, time, and a detailed understanding of the conventions that governed what was appropriate for which occasion. For women of the Victorian upper and upper middle classes, the process began with the corset. The Victorian corset was a structured garment of whalebone and steel laced tightly at the back to produce the fashionable silhouette of the period, a narrow waist above full skirts and a modest bust above. The tightness with which corsets were laced varied considerably, and the Victorian medical literature contains extensive debate about the health consequences of tight lacing that reflects genuine disagreement among physicians of the period about how much compression was permissible and at what cost. Over the corset went layers of petticoats and a crinoline or bustle, depending on which decade of the Victorian era we are considering. Since the fashionable silhouette changed significantly between the 1840s and the 1890s, over these understructures went the dress itself, typically a complex construction of multiple fabrics, trimmings, buttons, hooks, and fastenings that required a lady's maid to help put on correctly, and that expressed through its materials, its colors, and its cut the wearer's social position, her marital status, her age, and the specific occasion for which she was dressed. Morning dress, afternoon dress, visiting dress, dinner dress, and ball dress were distinct categories, each with their own conventions, and a Victorian lady of fashion might change her dress 3 or 4 times in the course of a single day. The quantity of clothing required to dress appropriately for every occasion was enormous, and the management of a lady's wardrobe was itself a significant administrative undertaking that fell to the lady's maid, whose skill and discretion were essential to her mistress's social reputation. Victorian dining was one of the most elaborate social performances in history. The dinner party was the central institution of Victorian elite social life, and everything about it was governed by rules that communicated social position and cultural refinement to every person present. The formal Victorian dinner followed a structure called service à la Russe, the Russian style, which had replaced the earlier practice of service à la Française during the middle decades of the century. In service à la Russe, Dishes were brought to the table in sequence and served by footmen to each diner individually, rather than being placed on the table simultaneously as they had been before. This change had significant consequences for the visual experience of the dinner table. It meant that the table itself could be decorated rather than covered with food, and Victorian dinner tables were decorated with extraordinary elaboration. Elaborate centerpieces of flowers and silver and crystal and fruit. Candelabra, casting warm light across damask tablecloths. Multiple sets of cutlery, laid precisely for each course. Crystal glasses of different sizes for different wines. Place cards in silver holders. Menus printed on small cards. The visual spectacle of a Victorian dinner table laid for a formal occasion was itself a statement of wealth and taste that the guests were expected to appreciate and to replicate at their own tables. The dinner itself might consist of a dozen or more courses, beginning with soup, proceeding through fish, entrees, removes, and game courses, before arriving at dessert and then the ritual of the women withdrawing to the drawing room, while the men remained at the table with the port and the political conversation that was considered unsuitable for female ears. The withdrawal of the women was one of the most distinctive rituals of Victorian dining, and one that reflected with perfect clarity the gendered assumptions about public and private, serious and decorative, that shaped every aspect of Victorian elite life. The Victorian drawing room was where social life was performed and judged. After dinner, the company would reassemble in the drawing room. The room that gave its name to the practice of withdrawing after dinner, and that was the primary stage on which Victorian social life was performed. The drawing room was furnished and decorated with an attention to detail and an accumulation of objects that reflected the Victorian belief that a room should demonstrate the taste, the travels, the interests, and the refinement of its occupants. Every surface held something. Every wall was covered. Pictures, watercolors, photographs in frames, stuffed birds under glass domes, china ornaments, silver objects, books arranged decoratively, plants in elaborate jardinières, needlework by the lady of the house, souvenirs of foreign travel, family portraits, and the accumulated debris of a life lived with sufficient resources to acquire beautiful and curious things from every corner of the world. The Victorians were collectors in a way that no previous generation had been, because they had the wealth, the empire, and the global trade networks to bring the whole world into their drawing rooms. The conversation that took place in these rooms was as carefully managed as the furnishings. Victorian social conversation had its own rules about what topics were acceptable and what were not. Religion and politics were theoretically avoided in mixed company, though in practice both surfaced constantly beneath other discussions. Money was never directly discussed, which was its own form of social performance, since everyone present was acutely aware of everyone else's financial position, and the pretense that this was irrelevant was itself a social skill. The ability to talk well, to be entertaining without being shocking, to be interested without being intrusive, to navigate the complex social dynamics of a mixed gathering with apparent ease and genuine grace, was one of the most highly valued accomplishments of the Victorian elite, and one that required as much practice and skill as playing the piano. The calling card system was a precisely calibrated social technology. The ritual of paying calls and leaving calling cards was one of the most elaborate and precisely codified social practices in Victorian elite life, and one that seems almost incomprehensibly formal to modern eyes, but that served a genuine social function in a world where maintaining the right relationships required constant active management. A calling card was a small printed card bearing the caller's name and sometimes their address. When a lady called on another lady, she would present her card to the butler or footman who answered the door and would be told whether the lady of the house was at home. Being at home did not necessarily mean that the lady was physically present in the house. It meant that she had decided to receive callers that day. If she was not at home, the caller would leave her card, and the visit would be acknowledged at a later date. If she was at home, a visit of between 15 and 30 minutes would follow, during which the social relationship between the two women would be maintained through conversation and the exchange of information about mutual acquaintances, family events, and the social calendar. The corners of calling cards could be folded in different ways to communicate different messages. A folded top right corner indicated that the call was in person rather than by servant. A folded bottom left corner indicated condolences. A folded bottom right corner indicated that the caller was taking leave before a journey. These conventions were understood by every participant in the system, and departures from them were noticed and discussed. The calling card system was not simply a social nicety. It was a form of social regulation that determined who was in and who was out, who was acknowledged and who was passed over, who belonged to the charmed circle and who existed outside it. For a Victorian woman of the upper or upper middle class to be cut, to have one's calls not returned and one's cards not reciprocated, was a social disaster of the first order that could damage a family's position in ways that were difficult to recover from. The London season was the annual ritual at the centre of Victorian elite social life. For the wealthy Victorian family with social ambitions, the London season was the most important event in the annual calendar. It ran roughly from May to August and consisted of an intense programme of balls, dinners, concerts, race meetings, flower shows, theatrical performances, and the various ceremonial occasions that punctuated the social calendar, and at which the upper and upper middle classes gathered to see each other, to be seen, to conduct business and negotiate alliances, and above all to marry their daughters to suitable men. The presentation at court was the formal entry point into the season. Young women making their social debut, known as coming out, were presented to the Queen or later to the Prince and Princess of Wales in a ceremony at Buckingham Palace or St James's Palace that required months of preparation and a specific court dress with a train of precise length and white feathers in the hair. The presentation was the social equivalent of a formal credential. It announced that a young woman was of the right birth and character to participate in the social world of the elite, and that her family had the connections and the resources to introduce her to it. The season that followed presentation was in many respects a highly organized marriage market, dressed up as social enjoyment. Young women attended balls and dinners and race meetings in the company of their mothers or chaperones, and were introduced to eligible young men with the clear understanding on all sides that the purpose of these introductions was to identify a suitable match. The negotiations that surrounded Victorian upper-class marriages were conducted partly in the drawing room and partly in the solicitor's office, where the financial settlements that accompanied any significant marriage were worked out with a precision and a frankness about money that was entirely absent from the social surface of the courtship. Victorian marriage transformed a woman's legal existence entirely. The legal position of a married woman in Victorian England was one of the most striking examples of the gap between the elevated social position that wealthy women occupied and the minimal legal personhood that marriage conferred on them. Under the doctrine of coverture that governed English law until the latter part of the Victorian period, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name. Any property she brought to the marriage became her husband's. Any money she earned, which in practice few women of her class would earn, belonged to her husband. She could not enter into contracts independently. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She had no independent legal existence separate from her husband, and the children of the marriage were legally his, not hers. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 reformed the most extreme provisions of coverture and gave married women the right to own and control their own property and earnings. But the social and practical consequences of the older legal framework persisted well beyond its formal reform in the attitudes and assumptions that shaped how Victorian marriages actually functioned. Within a marriage, the balance of power was entirely with the husband. He controlled the money, the household, and ultimately the social position of his wife and children. A wealthy Victorian wife who managed her household efficiently, entertained her husband's guests gracefully, raised her children according to the standards of her class, and maintained the social relationships that supported the family's position, was performing work of enormous complexity and importance for which she received no formal recognition and no financial compensation, and which depended entirely on the continued goodwill of the man she had married. Children in wealthy Victorian households lived in a world of their own within the house. The nursery suite was the children's world within the larger world of the country house. A set of rooms on an upper floor where the children of the family spent most of their time under the care of a nurse and later a governess. The separation of children from adult domestic life was one of the defining features of Victorian upper-class child rearing, and it shaped the experience of childhood in wealthy families in ways that seem almost startlingly remote from modern practice. A Victorian baby in a wealthy household would be cared for by a wet nurse, and later by a nurse who was responsible for the physical care of the child, its feeding, bathing, dressing, and daily routine. The mother would visit the nursery, typically in the afternoon, and the children would be brought down to the drawing room to be presented to their parents and any guests in the later part of the day. These visits were often the primary daily contact between children and parents in the most traditional Victorian households. The children were expected to be clean, well-behaved, and presentable. A brief appearance in adult life before being returned to the nursery and the world of their nurse and later their governess. The governess was one of the most poignant figures in Victorian domestic life. She occupied a liminal position in the household, educated enough to teach the children of the family, but not of sufficient social standing to mix with the family as an equal. She ate her meals separately, or with the children. She was not quite a servant and not quite a guest, and her position was one of constant social ambiguity that required considerable personal dignity to navigate. Victorian fiction is full of governesses, from Jane Eyre to Becky Sharp, because the governess figure crystallized with particular clarity the tensions around class and gender and dependence that ran through the whole of Victorian society. Victorian leisure was elaborate, expensive, and carefully class stratified. The leisure activities of the wealthy Victorian class were organized around a calendar of country pursuits, London engagements, and the various forms of sport and recreation that both expressed and reinforced the values of the elite. The shooting season was one of the central institutions of the Victorian country house calendar. From the 12th of August, the glorious 12th as it was known, when the grouse season opened on the Scottish moors, through the pheasant season that dominated the autumn months, the organisation of shooting parties was a major preoccupation of the Victorian country house owner. A shooting party might last several days and involve a dozen or more guests who required housing, feeding, and entertainment in addition to the shooting itself. The logistics of organizing such parties fell largely on the mistress of the house, who had to manage the accommodation, the food, the seating arrangements, and the social dynamics of a mixed group of guests, while maintaining the appearance of effortless hospitality that was the highest social achievement of the Victorian hostess. Hunting, the fox hunting that dominated the winter months in most English counties, was another central leisure institution of the Victorian country class. The hunt was both a sport and a social occasion, a visible demonstration of the riders' horsemanship, their courage, their knowledge of the countryside, and their membership in the community of the county gentry. Riding to hounds across the English countryside on a cold winter morning was understood as one of the defining pleasures of the class that owned the land being ridden across. The horses, the hounds, the huntsmen, the rituals of the meet, the chase, and the kill were all elements of a performance that expressed the values of the rural elite in a form that was simultaneously recreation and statement of identity. Victorian wealth came from land, industry, and empire, and the tensions between them were constant. The wealth that sustained the Victorian country house lifestyle came from sources that were more varied and more contested than the serene surface of elite life suggested. The oldest form of wealth was land. Families who had owned substantial English estates since the Tudor period or earlier drew their income from rents paid by tenant farmers and from the agricultural productivity of their own home farms. Agricultural land in England had been the foundation of aristocratic wealth for centuries, and the social prestige attached to it was out of proportion to its actual financial returns by the later Victorian period, when agricultural depression reduced the income from many great estates significantly. The newer form of wealth came from industry. The manufacturers of cotton and iron and steel and chemicals, who had created the Industrial Revolution, had accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the rental incomes of many traditional landed families. The tension between old money and new money, between the landed gentry who had always been wealthy and the industrial manufacturers who had recently become so, was one of the defining social tensions of the Victorian period. New wealth bought country estates and educated its sons at the right, schools and married its daughters into titled families in a systematic process of assimilation that gradually absorbed the industrial rich into the social world of the landed elite, while transforming that world in ways that the purest representatives of the old order found uncomfortable. Empire was the third source of Victorian wealth, and the one that connected the drawing rooms of English country houses most directly to the wider world. The trade in cotton and tea and sugar and spices and rubber and opium that flowed through the ports of a maritime empire generated returns that funded country houses and London townhouses, and the season, and the schools, and the clubs, and all the apparatus of Victorian elite life. Victorian religion was publicly central and privately complicated. The role of religion in Victorian elite life was one of the most complex and least easily summarized aspects of the period. On the surface, Victorian England was a deeply religious society. Church attendance was high. The Bible was universally known. Religious language permeated public discourse and private correspondence. The building of churches was one of the major architectural projects of the Victorian era, and the endowment of church livings by wealthy landowners was one of the ways in which property and spiritual authority were intertwined. The country house family occupied the family pew in the local parish church, and their presence or absence each Sunday was noted by the entire village. The squire and his family at the front of the church, and the tenant farmers and labourers ranked behind them in the pews, reflected the social hierarchy of the estate in the most explicit possible way. But beneath the surface of Victorian religious observance lay tensions and doubts that the confident exterior concealed. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 sent a tremor through Victorian religious certainty that was felt in the drawing rooms and libraries of the educated elite as much as in the lecture halls and scientific societies. The geological discoveries of the early Victorian period had already suggested that the Earth was vastly older than the biblical account implied. Darwin now suggested that the diversity of life, including human life, could be explained without reference to divine creation. The struggle to reconcile religious faith with scientific evidence was one of the defining intellectual experiences of the Victorian educated class, and it was conducted most visibly and most painfully in the private correspondence and diaries of men and women who had been raised in the certainty of faith and found that certainty increasingly difficult to maintain. Victorian death was an industry of mourning conducted with extraordinary elaboration. The Victorian relationship with death and mourning was one of the most distinctive and most commented upon aspects of the culture, and it reached its most elaborate expression in the upper and middle classes, whose resources allowed them to perform grief on a scale that was quite simply unavailable to the poor. When a death occurred in a wealthy Victorian household, the rituals that followed were prescribed in detail by a mourning culture that governed the colour of clothes, the duration of withdrawal from social life, the style of stationery used for correspondence, and the appropriate level of entertainment for a period of months or even years after the bereavement. Queen Victoria herself set the tone for the period's mourning culture by remaining in formal mourning for her husband Prince Albert for the remaining 40 years of her life after his death in 1861. Black was the colour of deep mourning in the first year after a significant bereavement. The precise shade and texture of black that was appropriate changed through the mourning period. From dull crepe in the deepest mourning to jet jewellery and silk later on, and the woman's ability to navigate these distinctions correctly was itself a form of social competence that was observed and evaluated. The funeral itself was a major event involving plumes and mutes and elaborate hearses, and the black-clad procession of mourners that made the social importance of the deceased visible to the wider community. The Victorian funeral industry grew to serve the mourning practices of all classes, and the undertaker who organised funerals for the wealthy could offer a spectacle of death that rivaled in its elaboration the wedding ceremonies of the same families. Death in the Victorian period was not hidden or minimised. It was displayed, ritualised, commemorated, and extended in ways that reflected a culture that took mortality seriously and that believed the appropriate response to loss was to make that loss visible to the world. The Victorian Grand Tour and the culture of travel among the wealthy. Travel was one of the great pleasures and social obligations of the Victorian upper class, and the wealthy Victorian family of the mid and late 19th century had access to a world of travel that previous generations could not have imagined. The railways that spread across Britain and Europe during the Victorian period transformed the experience of travel from a slow and uncomfortable ordeal into something that was still an adventure, but no longer an endurance test. The continental tour that had been the preserve of young aristocrats since the 17th century became accessible to a much wider section of the wealthy Victorian class as railways connected London to Paris to Rome to Florence to Venice, and the hotels that served these routes grew to provide the standards of comfort that wealthy travelers expected. Thomas Cook began organizing his famous package tours in the 1850s and 60s, initially to Switzerland and later to Egypt and the Holy Land, making organized travel available to the respectable middle classes who could not afford the private carriages and servants that aristocratic travel had previously required. The wealthy Victorian traveller, however, did not go on Thomas Cook tours. They travelled with their own servants, their own baggage in quantities that required significant logistical organisation, and their own letters of introduction to the British embassies and the English-speaking communities that existed in every significant European city. The purpose of travel for the Victorian upper class was partly pleasure, partly education, partly the acquisition of the cultural knowledge and aesthetic experience that distinguished the truly civilized from the merely wealthy. A young man who had seen the galleries of Florence and the ruins of Rome, and heard opera in Naples, and attended a salon in Paris, was considered to have completed his education in a way that his tutors at Oxford or Cambridge could not entirely provide. The tension between appearances and reality in Victorian elite life was profound and constant. One of the most striking things about the world of the wealthy Victorian, when you look at it closely, is the gap between the image it presented to the world and the reality that lay behind that image. The image was of a confident, prosperous, morally serious, and socially responsible class, whose wealth was the just reward of virtue and industry, and whose social position reflected their natural fitness to lead. The reality was more complicated, more anxious, more precarious, and more human than that image allowed. Many Victorian country house families were living beyond their means on credit, extended against the expectation of future agricultural income that the agricultural depression of the 1870s and 80s was already making unreliable. The estates that looked so prosperous and permanent were in many cases deeply mortgaged, and the lifestyle that the house implied was sustained by a constant management of debt that required the skills of a financier rather than a country gentleman. Victorian marriages that appeared models of domestic felicity sometimes concealed unhappiness and incompatibility, but the social impossibility of divorce, which required an Act of Parliament until 1857 and remained deeply stigmatizing after it, kept permanently hidden from public view. The double standard that permitted wealthy Victorian men a sexual freedom that was entirely forbidden to their wives and daughters created arrangements of hypocrisy that everyone in the relevant social circles knew about, and that no one was permitted to acknowledge. Victorian respectability was not simply a form of honesty. It was a performance that required everyone present to agree not to see what was clearly visible, and to maintain the fiction of the surface as a shared social project that served everyone's interests as long as everyone cooperated. What the servants thought of it all, and how they recorded what they knew. The servants of the Victorian country house saw everything. They were in the rooms when conversations occurred that their employers believed were private. They carried the notes and the letters that conducted the social life of the family. They cleaned up after the dinner parties and the shooting parties and the family quarrels. They dressed and undressed the bodies of their employers and witnessed the physical reality behind the social performance. They knew whose finances were troubled, and whose marriage was failing, and who drank too much, and who received letters they did not want their spouses to see. And they were required by the terms of their employment and by the social conventions of the period to behave as though they knew nothing. The discretion required of a Victorian servant was absolute in theory and somewhat less than absolute in practice. Gossip flowed freely in the servants' hall, and what was known below stairs had a way of eventually becoming known in the wider world. The Victorian servant memoir, which began to appear in larger numbers in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, offers a perspective on the country house world that is entirely different from the perspective of the family. It is a perspective of constant labor, of physical exhaustion, of rigid hierarchy within the servant community itself, of occasional warmth and loyalty toward employers who treated their servants well, and of occasional resentment toward those who did not. It is also a perspective of extraordinary observation. The servants who spent their working lives in Victorian country houses saw those houses from a vantage point that their employers never occupied, and what they saw was a more complicated and more human picture than the one that the families themselves would have recognized or endorsed. The Victorian era ended, and the world it had built disappeared faster than anyone expected. The world of the wealthy Victorian did not end slowly or gracefully. It ended with a war. The First World War that began in 1914 destroyed the Victorian country house world with a completeness and a speed that would have seemed impossible to anyone surveying that world in 1900, and one when the Queen died and the Edwardian era that followed her seemed to promise simply more of the same, slightly relaxed and rather more pleasure-seeking. The war took the young men who were the heirs and the future of the great houses and sent them to the Western Front, where many of them died in conditions that would have been unimaginable to their Victorian grandparents. It took the servants who had maintained the household and redirected them to the factories and the hospitals and the auxiliary services that the war required. It imposed taxes on wealth that the Victorian landed gentry had never been required to pay on the scale that the war demanded. And it created, for those who survived it, a world in which the assumptions and the values and the social arrangements of the Victorian era seemed not simply outdated, but actively discredited by the catastrophe that those assumptions and values had helped to produce. The great Victorian country houses that survived into the 20th century did so in various states of transformation. Some became schools. Some became hotels. Some became government offices. Some were demolished, their building materials sold for what they would fetch, and their parklands converted to agricultural use. A significant number passed to the National Trust and are now visited by millions of people each year who walk through the staterooms and the kitchens and the servants' quarters and try to imagine what it felt like to live there when the house was alive with the specific and extraordinary world that the Victorian wealthy had constructed around themselves and that the 20th century took away. And so we come gently to the end of our evening in the Victorian world. We have walked the long drives of country houses and sat in drawing rooms full of accumulated things and carefully managed conversation. We have dressed for dinner and undressed for bed and navigated the calling card system and the London season and the elaborate rituals of mourning that gave grief a social form. We have eaten enormous breakfasts and elaborate dinners and drunk tea in the afternoon and port after the women withdrew, and argued about Darwin in the library after everyone else had gone to bed. We have seen the servants who made it all possible, moving through the back passages of a world that depended on them entirely and acknowledged them almost not at all. We have looked behind the confident surface of Victorian prosperity and found the mortgaged estates and the constrained marriages and the religious doubts and the social anxieties that the surface was constructed to conceal. And we have watched the whole extraordinary edifice come apart in the years after 1914 with a speed that suggests it was more fragile than it looked, and that the world it had constructed was held together as much by shared agreement not to look too closely as by any deeper. Structural strength. The Victorian wealthy lived in a world of extraordinary beauty and comfort and constraint. They believed in their own rightness with a confidence that the century that followed them would comprehensively challenge. But they also built things, both physical and cultural, that have lasted beyond them. The country houses that survive, the literature that was written in them, the gardens that were planted around them, the art that was collected in them, the social and legal reforms that were argued about in them, and eventually, painfully achieved. They were complicated people living in a complicated time, doing their best with the frameworks and the assumptions they had inherited, and passing on to the world that followed them a mixture of beauty and injustice and ambition and hypocrisy that the modern world is still sorting through. If this quiet journey through the Victorian drawing room brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment there is nothing more to follow. Let the drawing room fire burn low. Let the footman extinguish the candles one by one. Let the house settle into its nightly silence. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The Victorian world has kept its watch long enough for one evening. Sleep well. Good night. The Victorian country house kitchen was a world entirely unto itself. Below stairs, in a Victorian country house, the kitchen was the engine room of the entire establishment, and the cook who ran it was one of the most powerful and most skilled people in the household. A Victorian country house kitchen was not one room, but a complex of rooms, each serving a specific function in the production of the meals that the dining room above required. The main kitchen, where the cooking was done, the scullery, where the washing up was performed, and where the lowest ranking kitchen maid spent her days in a permanent state of hot water and hard work. The larder, where meat and other perishables were stored, a cool north-facing room with stone shelves and a stone floor that served as the refrigeration system of the pre-electric age. The game larder, where the pheasants and partridges and hares brought back from the shooting parties were hung for the precise number of days required to develop the right flavour. The dairy, where cream and butter and cheese were produced from the milk of the home farm's herd. The still room, where the housekeeper made the preserves and pickles and cordials, and the household medicines that supplemented what the doctor provided. The bakehouse, where the bread and pastry that the household consumed in enormous quantities were produced fresh each morning. The kitchen fire burned from early morning until late at night, and the heat it generated in a Victorian kitchen in summer was described by those who worked there as almost unendurable. The cook managed this entire operation with the authority of a general and the precision of a mathematician, planning menus days in advance, ordering supplies through the housekeeper, training her kitchen maids, and producing to order the elaborate meals that the dining room demanded at the precise moment they were required. A Victorian cook of real skill was a valued and sometimes very well-paid professional, whose reputation could follow her from household to household, and whose departure could cause genuine disruption to a family's social life. The mistress of the house might manage the menus with the cook each morning in a formal meeting that was one of the key rituals of household management. The mistress decided what would be served. The cook decided how it would be made, and between them they produced the dinners and luncheons and breakfasts that were the primary public expression of the household's hospitality and taste. Victorian health and the extraordinary remedies that wealthy Victorians relied upon. The health of the wealthy Victorian family was managed through a combination of genuine medical care, inherited folk remedies, fashionable theories of dubious validity, and the services of a family physician whose relationship with the household was as much social as medical. The Victorian doctor who attended a wealthy family was a gentleman himself, educated and respectful, who understood that his relationship with his patients was partly about medicine and partly about trust and social connection. He visited the house for social as well as medical reasons, was known by name to every member of the household, and was as likely to offer advice on questions of diet and lifestyle as to prescribe specific treatments for specific conditions. Victorian medicine was making genuine progress in some areas during this period. The germ theory of disease, developed by Pasteur and Koch, was gradually transforming the understanding of infection during the second half of the century. Anesthesia, introduced in the 1840s, had transformed surgery from an experience of conscious agony into something that a patient could sleep through. The antiseptic techniques introduced by Joseph Lister in the 1860s were reducing the catastrophic rates of post-surgical infection that had previously made operations almost as dangerous as the conditions they treated. But these advances coexisted in the Victorian medical world with theories and treatments that were considerably less well-founded. Hydropathy, the water cure, was enormously fashionable among the Victorian wealthy and spa towns, and hydropathic establishments offered weeks of treatment involving cold baths and hot baths and steam and douches that wealthy Victorians undertook in the belief that water in various forms could address almost any medical condition. The seaside, believed to offer beneficial effects from the sea air and sea bathing, drew the Victorian wealthy in large numbers to coastal resorts where they could combine the pleasures of a holiday with the reassurance that they were doing something good for their health. The more exotic end of Victorian medicine included electrical treatments, magnetic therapies, and a range of patent medicines containing ingredients whose actual effects were rarely what their manufacturers claimed. The Victorian library and the intellectual life of the country house. The library was one of the most important rooms in a Victorian country house, and one that reflected most directly the intellectual pretensions and actual interests of the family that owned it. A great Victorian library might contain thousands of volumes accumulated across several generations, including the leather-bound classics of a classical education, the histories and biographies and travel writings that formed the staple of Victorian non-fiction reading, the novels of Dickens and Thackeray and George Eliot and Trollope that engaged so directly and so perceptively with the Victorian world itself, the scientific works that the more intellectually adventurous members of the family might read with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, and the periodicals and newspapers and reviews that kept the household connected to the intellectual life of the time. Reading was one of the primary leisure activities of the Victorian wealthy, and the Victorian period was one of the great ages of the novel precisely because the novel addressed with such directness and such skill the questions of class and money and marriage and morality and social position that occupied the minds of the people who read them. The circulating library, most famously Mudie's Select Circulating Library in London, made the latest novels available to subscribers across the country, and the selection of books that Mudie's would or would not carry gave that institution a quasi-moral authority over Victorian fiction that influenced what writers wrote and what publishers published. The Victorian Country House Library was also a working space where the master of the house conducted his estate business, wrote his letters, received his agent and his solicitor, and managed the financial and administrative affairs of the household and the estate. The estate agent, who managed the farms, and the tenants, and the solicitor, who managed the legal arrangements, and the land steward, who oversaw the agricultural operations, all reported to the master in the library in a series of regular consultations that constituted the real work of running a Victorian landed estate. The house might look like a pleasure palace, but behind the pleasure was the constant work of management that kept the whole thing functioning. Victorian sport and the enormous importance of horsemanship to the wealthy class. Among the many leisure pursuits of the Victorian wealthy none occupied more time, more money, or more social significance than the various sports and activities that centered on horses. The horse in Victorian elite life was not simply a means of transport or a source of sporting entertainment. It was a cultural symbol of almost inexhaustible richness. To ride well was to demonstrate physical courage, control, athletic skill, and the kind of easy mastery over natural force that the Victorian elite associated with their own position in the world. A young man who could not ride was socially disadvantaged in ways that went beyond the merely practical. He lacked one of the defining accomplishments of his class, and that lack was noted and quietly held against him. Young women of the Victorian upper class were also expected to ride in a side saddle that required its own considerable skill and that produced a distinctive upright posture that was one of the visual emblems of female Victorian breeding. The stables of a Victorian country house were often the most expensive and most carefully maintained buildings on the estate. The horses themselves represented significant financial investment, and their care was entrusted to a hierarchy of grooms and stable boys under the authority of the head groom, who held a position of considerable responsibility and status within the servant community. Racing was the sport of kings and the sport of the Victorian wealthy, who attended the great race meetings of the calendar as social occasions as much as sporting events. Ascot and Epsom and Goodwood and Newmarket were fixed points in the Victorian social calendar where horse racing provided the pretext for an elaborate social gathering of the upper class that combined gambling, fashion display, royal proximity, and the particular pleasure of watching beautiful animals perform at the limits of their extraordinary speed. The Victorian philanthropist and the complicated relationship between wealth and conscience. One of the most distinctive features of Victorian wealthy life was the combination of immense private privilege with a genuine and sometimes agonized sense of social responsibility. The Victorian wealthy were not, by and large, indifferent to the suffering that existed alongside their own comfort. Many of them were deeply troubled by it and channeled that trouble into philanthropic activity on a scale that was genuinely significant. The building of hospitals, schools, almshouses, and churches, the endowment of university colleges and scientific institutions, the founding of charitable organizations to address poverty, illness, moral reform, and the education of the working class, the participation in campaigns for the abolition of slavery, for prison reform, for the regulation of factory conditions, for the improvement of public sanitation and housing. All of these were activities in which Victorian wealthy men and women participated with a seriousness and an energy that produced real results. Victorian philanthropy was also, inevitably, shaped by the class assumptions and social prejudices of those who practiced it. The deserving poor, who could be helped with a clear conscience, were distinguished from the undeserving poor, whose condition was understood as the result of their own moral failings. The philanthropist who built a model housing estate for working families typically also built into it conditions and rules that reflected assumptions about the habits and character of the poor that the poor themselves might not have recognized or endorsed. Victorian philanthropy was genuine. It was also paternalistic, class-bound, and shaped by assumptions about who deserved help and on what terms that reflected the limitations of the world from which it came. But it built things that lasted. Hospitals and schools and libraries and parks that served working-class communities for generations, and that stand today as evidence that the Victorian wealthy were capable, at their best, of something beyond the maintenance of their own comfort. The Victorian garden and the extraordinary horticultural ambitions of the wealthy class. The garden of a Victorian country house was one of the most labour-intensive and most visually spectacular expressions of the wealth and taste of its owners. Victorian gardening was not a modest domestic pursuit. It was an art form, a science, and a competitive social activity practiced on a scale that required the labour of teams of gardeners working under the authority of a head gardener whose knowledge of horticulture, soil chemistry, propagation, and design made him one of the most skilled employees on the estate. The Victorian garden was divided into distinct areas, each serving a different function and governed by different aesthetic principles. The formal gardens immediately around the house, typically including parterres of bedding plants, laid out in elaborate patterns that were replanted several times each year to ensure continuous colour. The kitchen garden, walled and productive, growing the vegetables and fruit and cut flowers that the house consumed in enormous quantities throughout the year. The glasshouses and hothouses where exotic plants were cultivated and out-of-season vegetables and fruits were forced for the table. The pleasure grounds of lawn and specimen trees, and perhaps a lake that provided the naturalistic landscape through which guests would walk, and which provided the setting within which the house itself was seen. The Victorian era was one of the great ages of horticultural discovery. Plant hunters employed by wealthy landowners and by the great nursery firms were travelling to China and Japan and South America and South Africa, and returning with new species that transformed the palette of the English garden. Rhododendrons and azaleas from the Himalayas, Japanese maples and cherries, South American monkey puzzle trees, Australian tree ferns, and New Zealand flax. The Victorian garden was a living expression of empire, drawing into the English landscape the plants of every territory that British enterprise had opened to exploration and exploitation. It was also simply beautiful. The great Victorian gardens that survive today, at Sissinghurst and Hidcote, and Chatsworth and Starhead, remain among the most visited and most admired horticultural achievements that the English-speaking world has produced. The Victorian music room and the central role of music in domestic life. Music in a wealthy Victorian household was not simply entertainment. It was a social necessity and a marker of cultivation that every member of the household was expected to participate in to some degree, and that the women of the family were expected to participate in to a considerable degree. The accomplishment of playing the piano was considered essential to the education of a Victorian girl of good family, and the hours spent at the piano in the schoolroom under the supervision of a governess or a music master were among the most consistent features of upper-class female education across the entire period. Playing the piano for family and guests in the drawing room after dinner was one of the primary social performances expected of a young Victorian woman, and her ability to play with fluency and feeling was understood as a direct reflection of her education, her character, and the quality of her upbringing. Singing was similarly valued. The parlour song, a genre of music specifically designed for domestic performance, reached its Victorian peak in the compositions of composers like Arthur Sullivan, and the enormous market for sheet music that served the domestic music making of the Victorian middle and upper classes, was one of the significant commercial enterprises of the period. Professional musicians were engaged to perform at the larger London entertainments of the season, and the great operatic and concert performances that took place at Covent Garden and the Crystal Palace and the new Queen's Hall were attended by the Victorian wealthy as part of their cultural obligations and as occasions for the social display that accompanied all their public appearances. The arrival of the phonograph in the later Victorian period began to change the relationship between music and domestic life in ways that would only fully manifest in the following century. But for most of the Victorian era, music in the home was made by the people who lived there and heard at public performances attended in person. A relationship with music that made its production an active skill rather than a passive consumption. The Victorian country house party and the social dynamics of the weekend visit. The house party was one of the central institutions of Victorian elite social life, and the management of a successful one was among the most demanding challenges that the mistress of a great house could face. A Victorian country house party might last from Friday evening to Monday morning and involve 12 to 20 guests who required accommodation in the best available bedrooms, entertainment through a program of shooting or hunting or croquet or archery or visits to local sites, meals of appropriate elaboration 3 times a day, plus afternoon tea, and the management of the social dynamics of a mixed group who might include people of very different temperaments and mutual relationships, and who needed to be kept amused and comfortable and in good humor for the duration of their stay. The allocation of bedrooms was itself a significant social exercise. The most important guests received the best rooms. The precise hierarchy of importance was not always obvious, and mistakes in the allocation of rooms could give lasting offense to guests who felt they had been undervalued. The seating at meals required similar careful management. The precedent system that governed who sat where at a Victorian dinner table was complex and precisely hierarchical, and a hostess who made errors in the seating was failing in one of her primary professional responsibilities. The success of a house party was measured partly in the entertainment provided and partly in the social reputation it built for the hostess. A woman whose house parties were known to be well managed, whose guests were always well chosen and well mixed, whose food was excellent and whose shooting was good, and whose social management was impeccable, was a social force of the first order, whose invitations were valued and whose friendship was sought. The Victorian nursery, and how wealthy children experienced the world. The nursery in a Victorian country house was not simply a room for children. It was a separate domestic world within the larger house, with its own routines, its own hierarchy, its own meals, and its own relationship to the world of the adults below. Children in wealthy Victorian households were in many respects more separated from their parents than children in any previous generation of the same class. The institution of the professional nurse, a woman employed specifically to care for the physical needs of young children, meant that the daily intimate care that parents in earlier periods had provided was now delegated to a paid professional. The nurse was often a figure of great importance to Victorian children, more constantly present and more physically intimate than either parent, a relationship that could be one of genuine warmth and lasting affection, or one of the rigid discipline and emotional distance that Victorian ideas about child rearing sometimes demanded. The nursery meals were simpler than the meals served in the dining room, reflecting the Victorian belief that rich food was unsuitable for children, and that the simple diet of bread and butter and milk and plain puddings was more appropriate to the developing constitution than the elaborate adult table. Victorian children of wealthy families played with toys that were considerably more elaborate than those available to any previous generation, reflecting both the manufacturing capacity of industrial Britain and the growing cultural significance attached to childhood as a distinct life stage. Dolls' houses that reproduced in miniature the houses their owners lived in, complete with tiny furniture and tiny servants and tiny dinner services. Toy soldiers in lead that reproduced the armies of the empire. Rocking horses of painted wood with real horsehair manes and tails. Clockwork toys that performed mechanical wonders. The Victorian nursery was filled with objects that reflected in miniature the values and assumptions of the adult world that surrounded it. The Victorian woman of leisure and the work she was not supposed to be doing. The ideal Victorian woman of the upper class was understood to be a woman of leisure, a woman whose entire existence was devoted to the domestic sphere, to the management of her household, the raising of her children, the maintenance of her social relationships, and the cultivation of the accomplishments that made her an ornament to her family. She was not supposed to work for money. She was not supposed to pursue professional ambitions. She was not supposed to concern herself with politics or business or any of the serious matters that were understood to belong to the male sphere. The reality of Victorian upper-class women's lives was considerably more complex and more active than this ideal suggested. The management of a large Victorian household was itself a demanding full-time occupation that required administrative skill, financial judgment, knowledge of food and medicine and household technology, the ability to manage a large staff, and the social intelligence to maintain the relationships on which the family's position depended. Beyond the household, many Victorian women of the upper and upper middle classes were involved in philanthropic and charitable work that took them out of the domestic sphere entirely and into the world of hospitals, schools, workhouses, and reform movements where they exercised a genuine and sometimes significant influence. Some Victorian women pushed further still. Florence Nightingale reformed the nursing profession from a background of upper middle class respectability that gave her access to the corridors of power while her gender prevented her from walking openly through them. Barbara Bodisham and Emily Davies founded Girton College at Cambridge to provide women with the university education that the institutions themselves continued to withhold full recognition for. Josephine Butler campaigned for legal reform on behalf of prostitutes in direct and deliberate defiance of every social convention that told women of her class to remain silent. The Victorian ideal of the leisured domestic woman coexisted throughout the period with the reality of women who were doing things that the ideal said they should not, and changing the world in the process. The final decades of the Victorian era and the sense of an ending that suffused elite life. By the 1890s, the last decade of Victoria's long reign, there was a quality in the air of the Victorian wealthy world that contemporaries found difficult to name precisely, but that we can recognize from the outside as a sense of ending. Not a collapse, not a crisis, but a feeling that the certainties that had sustained the Victorian world were becoming less certain than they had been, and that the world that lay on the other side of the century might look quite different from the one that had preceded it. The great agricultural estates were under financial pressure from the continuing depression in land values and the emergence of cheap American grain that undercut the prices that British farming had previously commanded. The political settlement that had kept the aristocracy at the centre of British life was being challenged by the growing power of the liberal and labour movements, and by the extension of the franchise that had brought more and more working-class men into the electorate. The social settlement that had kept women in the domestic sphere was being challenged with increasing organisation and confidence by the suffrage movement that would, in the following decade, become impossible to ignore. The intellectual settlement that had allowed educated Victorians to maintain some form of religious faith alongside their acceptance of modern science was under pressure from both directions, as the implications of Darwinian evolution for traditional Christian belief became harder to soften or avoid. The Victorian wealthy at the end of the century were people who had inherited a world of extraordinary stability and self-confidence, and who were beginning to feel that stability becoming less reliable beneath them. They danced at the balls of the season and shot the pheasants in the autumn, and managed their estates and dined their guests and sent their sons to Eton and their daughters to be presented at court, and in every outward respect continued to live as though the world they had inherited would continue forever. It did not continue forever. It continued for another 15 years. And then 1914 arrived, and the world of the wealthy Victorian ended with a completeness and a finality that all the certainty and all the comfort and all the elaborate ritual of the preceding decades had given no one any reason to expect. The Victorian townhouse and the rhythm of life in the London season. For the wealthy Victorian family with a country house, the London season required a second establishment, a townhouse in one of the fashionable districts of the capital that could be opened up for the months between May and August, and then closed again when the family returned to the country. The fashionable addresses of Victorian London were concentrated in the area west of Regent Street and south of Oxford Street, known as Mayfair and Belgravia, where the great squares and the broad streets were lined with terraced houses of Georgian and early Victorian construction that provided the urban basis from which the season's social life was conducted. A London townhouse required its own establishment of servants, either brought up from the country house or engaged separately for the London period, and its own kitchen and cellars and stabling for the horses and carriages that transported the family to the balls and dinners and theatre performances and morning calls that filled the season's calendar. The rhythm of a day during the London season was quite different from the rhythm of country life. Morning calls and shopping expeditions in the late morning, luncheon at home or with friends, a drive in Hyde Park in the afternoon, when the fashionable world circulated in its carriages along Rotten Row in a slow parade of horses and fashion and social display that was one of the most characteristic Victorian spectacles. Dinner at 8, followed by an evening engagement that might be a ball lasting until 3 or 4 in the morning, an opera performance at Covent Garden, a reception at a great house, or a private concert of the kind that the musical life of the season provided. The pace of the London season was exhausting by design. The constant round of engagements was not simply social pleasure. It was work of a specific kind, the work of maintaining visibility, of being seen in the right places with the right people, of moving one's daughters through the social world in a way that maximized their chances of meeting the right men, of building and sustaining the relationships that translated social position into political and economic advantage. The season ended in August, partly because Parliament rose in August, and the men whose political activities gave the season much of its purpose were then free to return to their estates for the shooting that they had been looking forward to since February. The Victorian railway journey and how travel transformed the experience of the wealthy. The railways that spread across Britain from the 1830s onward transformed the experience of the wealthy Victorian in ways that went far beyond the simple matter of getting from place to place more quickly. Before the railways, a journey from London to Edinburgh took several days by road and was an endurance test that left travellers exhausted and often ill from the effects of the road. By rail, the same journey took less than 10 hours and could be accomplished in a first-class carriage of comfortable dimensions with heating and upholstered seats and the company of other first-class passengers who had been separated from the second and third class by the literal physical structure of the railway carriage. The class differentiation of Victorian railway travel was explicit and deliberate and reflected in every dimension of the experience, from the separate entrances and waiting rooms at the major stations to the quality of the upholstery and the provision of refreshments. For the wealthy Victorian, the railway opened up the possibility of a much more mobile life than previous generations had enjoyed. A country house that had previously required days of travel from London could now be reached in hours, which meant that a family could maintain a more active presence in both their country and their urban lives simultaneously. The great country houses of the Victorian period were often connected to the railway network by private branches or by express services that stopped at the nearest station to the house, and that allowed the family and their guests to arrive and depart with a frequency and convenience that would have been inconceivable before. The private railway carriage, available to the very wealthiest, was the ultimate expression of Victorian first-class travel. A personal salon on wheels that could be attached to scheduled services and that provided the traveller with all the comforts of a private drawing room while covering the distance between one estate and another. The Victorian ball and everything that happened before, during, and after it. The ball was the most spectacular and most socially significant of all the entertainments that Victorian elite life produced. A great Victorian ball might be attended by several hundred guests, and its organisation required months of preparation and the expenditure of sums that reflected the importance of the occasion to the family giving it and to the social world that would attend. The invitations went out weeks in advance on cards of the prescribed format, listing the names of the hosts, the date and time, and sometimes the character of the entertainment. The preparation of a young woman for her first ball was a significant event in itself, involving the acquisition of a ball gown of appropriate style and expense, dancing lessons that had typically been proceeding for years, instruction in the etiquette of the ballroom including how to receive a partner, how to manage a dance card, and how to decline a dance gracefully without giving offence to the person declined. The dance card was one of the most distinctive artifacts of the Victorian ballroom. It was a small card with a pencil attached on which the dances of the evening were listed and against which partners could write their names to reserve a specific dance in advance. A popular girl at a Victorian ball would have her card filled early in the evening and could legitimately decline to dance with anyone who approached her after that point. An unpopular girl who arrived at the end of the evening with an empty or only partly filled card suffered one of the most visible forms of social failure that the Victorian ballroom could produce. The waltzes and polkas and quadrilles that made up the programme of a Victorian ball were dances that required physical proximity between partners that was carefully regulated by the conventions of the ballroom, and that provided one of the few contexts in which a young man and a young woman of respectable family could be physically close to each other in public without impropriety. The ballroom was therefore a space of contained romantic possibility in which the social drama of courtship could be enacted under the eyes of chaperones and parents, with enough cover of dancing and music and general gaiety for conversations to occur that might lead somewhere. The Victorian country house and its relationship to the land that surrounded it. The relationship between a great Victorian country house and the estate that surrounded it was not simply a matter of landscape gardening and agricultural management. It was a political and social relationship of considerable complexity that shaped the lives of everyone in the surrounding area and that reflected in concentrated form the broader relationship between the landowning class and the society it dominated. The tenant farmers who rented the agricultural land from the estate were not independent businessmen in any modern sense. They were dependent on the continued goodwill of their landlord for the security of their farms and their livelihoods, and the relationship between landlord and tenant was governed by a combination of legal, agreement, and personal relationship that gave the landlord an enormous amount of informal power over the practical and social lives of those who farmed his land. The agricultural labourers who worked for the tenant farmers were at the bottom of this rural hierarchy, dependent on the farmer who employed them, and ultimately on the landlord whose decisions shaped everything about the agricultural world they inhabited. The relationship between the great house and the village that typically existed nearby was a daily reality for every person who lived in it. The squire was the magistrate who settled local disputes. The squire's wife was the patron of the local school and the distributor of charitable relief. The squire's son was the officer who would command the local men in the volunteer yeomanry that provided a military reserve for the county. The squire's family pew in the church defined the social hierarchy of the community in physical form every Sunday morning. This was not simply the dominance of wealth. It was the dominance of a class that understood itself as having genuine obligations toward the people who lived within its sphere, as well as genuine rights over them. Paternalism is a word that captures both the care and the condescension that characterized this relationship at its best and at its most characteristic. The Victorian country house sale, and what happened when the money ran out. For all the apparent solidity and permanence of the Victorian country house world, it rested on financial foundations that were in many cases more precarious than the thick walls and broad acres of the great estates suggested. Agricultural depression in the later Victorian period reduced the rental income from land that was the foundation of aristocratic wealth, at precisely the moment when the costs of maintaining a great house in the style that social convention demanded were continuing to rise. The death duties introduced by the Liberal government in 1894 for the first time taxed the inheritance of great estates in a way that made each generation of succession more costly than the last. Families that had sustained their estates for centuries found themselves making choices between maintaining the house and maintaining the estate that previous generations had never had to face. The country house sale, in which the contents of a great house were dispersed at auction to the highest bidder, was one of the most poignant Victorian social spectacles. The furniture and the pictures and the silver and the china and the library and the accumulated contents of generations laid out in a series of auction rooms and sold to dealers and collectors and museums and the simply curious who came to see the dissolution of a world they had previously known only from outside. The house itself might follow, sold for conversion or demolished for the value of its materials, or preserved by some combination of luck and circumstance that allowed it to survive into a century that would eventually learn to value it. The Victorian country house sales of the late 19th and early 20th centuries dispersed an enormous quantity of art and furniture into the wider world of museums and private collections, where it can still be found today, the scattered remnants of an entire way of life that the Victorian wealthy had constructed with such confidence and such care, and that time and taxation and war and social change had dismantled with a thoroughness that those same Victorians would have found almost impossible to imagine. The Victorian education system and how the wealthy sent their sons to be made into gentlemen. The education of a Victorian boy of good family followed a path that was as prescribed and as carefully managed as any other aspect of the social reproduction of the elite. From the nursery and the governess in early childhood, the boy of a wealthy Victorian family would typically proceed to a preparatory school around the age of 8 or 9. A private boarding school where the foundations of classical education were laid alongside the social skills and the physical toughening that the public school to which he would proceed at 13 was understood to require of its entrance. The great English public schools, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Rugby, and the others that formed the top of the private education hierarchy were the institutions through which the Victorian elite reproduced itself across generations with remarkable consistency. They provided not primarily an academic education, though the classical curriculum of Latin and Greek and mathematics was demanding enough for those who engaged with it seriously. They provided something more important in the Victorian social context, which was an education in how to be a particular kind of person. The values of the Victorian public school, team spirit, physical courage, stoicism in the face of discomfort, loyalty to the institution and to one's fellow students, the subordination of individual desire to collective obligation, were values designed to produce the officers and administrators and politicians who would run the empire and govern the country and manage the great estates that their fathers were passing on to them. The experience of the Victorian public school was not always comfortable. The fagging system by which younger boys served older ones, the corporal punishment administered by masters and by prefects, the physical hardship of cold dormitories and inadequate heating, the bullying that occurred within any institution where boys of widely varying temperaments were confined together. All of these were understood by the Victorian establishment not as problems to be solved, but as features of the system, the difficulties through which a boy became a man and acquired the resilience and the indifference to personal comfort that the Victorian gentleman was expected to display. From public school, the Victorian boy of good family would typically proceed to Oxford or Cambridge, where 2 or 3 years of university life provided further social education and the network of friendships and connections that would serve him throughout his professional and social life. The academic content of a Victorian Oxford or Cambridge education was less important in most cases than the social experience it provided. You went to Oxford to meet the people you would spend the rest of your life with in the corridors of power and the clubs of Pall Mall and the country houses where the real business of Victorian elite life was conducted. The Victorian Club and the male spaces where power was exercised and maintained. For the Victorian gentleman of the upper class, the London Club was one of the most important institutions in his social and professional life. The great clubs of Pall Mall and St. James's, the Reform and the Athenaeum, and the Carlton and White's and Brooks's were not simply places to eat and drink and read the newspapers in comfort away from the demands of domestic life. They were institutions of genuine power where the social networks of the elite were maintained and where the informal conversations that shaped political decisions and business arrangements and social judgments took place in conditions of comfort and confidentiality that no other setting quite replicated. Membership of the right clubs was a form of social credential, as significant as education or family connection. To be blackballed, to have one's application for membership rejected by the anonymous vote of existing members, was a social setback of genuine consequence that reflected badly not only on the rejected applicant, but on the members who had proposed him. The clubs were exclusively male. Women had no access to them, and the Victorian gentleman who spent his evenings at his club was exercising a freedom of movement and association that was simply not available to his wife. This asymmetry was so deeply built into the assumptions of the period that it was rarely articulated or defended. It was simply the way things were. Men had the clubs and the professions and the parliament and the vote. Women had the drawing room and the charitable committee and the domestic sphere. And the world, the Victorian world, was quite certain, was the better for this arrangement. The Victorian relationship with empire and what it looked like from the drawing room. The British Empire that the Victorian period both inherited and enormously expanded was present in the drawing rooms and dining rooms of the wealthy in ways that were simultaneously intimate and entirely abstracted from the human reality of what empire meant. The tea that was poured at 4 o'clock came from India or Ceylon, where millions of workers laboured on plantations in conditions that bore no resemblance to the comfortable room in which it was being consumed. The cotton in the household's linen came from Egypt or India or the American South, where its cultivation had for generations depended on enslaved labour, whose abolition the Victorian period took pride in having achieved, while continuing to benefit from the economic structures slavery had created. The mahogany furniture, the ivory ornaments, the rubber plants in their jardinières, the exotic species in the shooting party's gamebook, the spices in the kitchen, and the indigo in the blue fabric of the drawing room curtains. All of these were the products of an empire that connected the country house drawing room to a world of labour and extraction, and often of violence, that the drawing room itself was designed to make invisible. This is not to say that the Victorian wealthy were uniformly indifferent to the realities of empire. Many were deeply engaged with the reform movements that sought to improve the conditions of subject peoples and to hold the imperial administration to higher standards of justice and humanity. The anti-slavery movement of the earlier 19th century had drawn much of its energy and its funding from precisely the class we are considering. But the structural reality of empire, the way in which British wealth and British power depended on the subordination of peoples and territories that had not chosen that subordination, was a reality that the comfort of the drawing room made it possible, and perhaps necessary, not to examine too closely. The Victorians who benefited most from empire were often the ones who thought about it least, and that comfortable inattention is itself one of the most revealing things about the world they inhabited. The Victorian country house at Christmas and the rituals of the festive season. Christmas in a great Victorian country house was one of the most elaborate and most warmly remembered events in the social calendar, a time when the usual formality of the household was modified by the rituals of celebration and generosity that the Victorian reinvention of Christmas had made the defining festival of the year. The Victorian period was in many respects the age in which Christmas as we know it was created or recreated. The Christmas tree, introduced to Britain by Prince Albert from German tradition, had spread rapidly from the royal household to the houses of the wealthy, and from there to the wider population. The exchange of Christmas cards, enabled by the cheap penny post, had become by the middle of the century an enormous annual industry. The Christmas dinner, with its turkey and its pudding and its elaborate preparation, had been codified and celebrated in Dickens's A Christmas Carol of 1843, in a form that proved enormously influential on how the season was observed. In a great Victorian country house, the Christmas period might extend over several weeks, from mid-December to Twelfth Night in January, with a succession of house parties bringing family and friends to the house for a program of hunting and shooting, and dinners and dancing and carol singing, and the distribution of gifts and Christmas boxes to the servants and the tenants that reflected the paternalistic obligations of the wealthy toward those in their sphere. The warmth of a Victorian country house Christmas, the fires blazing, the table laden, the tree glittering, the children allowed downstairs, the servants briefly more visible and more celebrated than usual, the cold and dark of the English winter held at bay by the heat and light and company of a house full of people who belonged together, was a genuine pleasure and a genuine comfort, and it produced in those who experienced it a warmth of memory that many of them would describe in their letters and diaries and memoirs as one of the things they most valued about the life they had been born into. That warmth was real. It was also the warmth of a very particular and very privileged kind of life that most of the people in Victorian Britain did not share and could not have imagined sharing. The country house Christmas was beautiful precisely because it was exceptional, and it was exceptional precisely because the world that surrounded it was considerably less comfortable, less warm, and less abundant than the house itself appeared to be. The Victorian art collection and what the wealthy chose to hang on their walls. The art that decorated the walls of a great Victorian country house was not simply decoration. It was a statement about the family's history, its taste, its education, and its place in the cultural life of the nation. The old master paintings that hung in the picture galleries of the grandest houses had in many cases been collected by ancestors in the 17th and 18th centuries on their grand tours of Italy and the Netherlands, and represented an investment in cultural capital that expressed the family's connection to the great traditions of European civilization. A Titian, or a Rembrandt, or a Claude Lorraine, hanging in the long gallery of an English country house, told visitors that the family had been wealthy and cultivated for long enough to have acquired things of genuine historical importance and to have maintained them across generations. Victorian families who had made their money more recently and who lacked the inherited collections of the old aristocracy could acquire new paintings from the flourishing market in contemporary British art that the Victorian period produced. The Royal Academy Summer Exhibition was the most important annual showcase for contemporary British painting, and the works exhibited there were purchased by wealthy collectors whose patronage sustained the careers of the most successful painters of the period. Victorian narrative painting, works that told stories from history or literature or contemporary life with a clarity and an emotional directness that made them immediately accessible to audiences without specialist training in art history, was enormously popular with the Victorian wealthy, and the most successful painters of the genre achieved incomes that reflected the scale of their commercial success. The portrait was a constant in the Victorian country house collection, each generation adding to the sequence of family likenesses that lined the staircase and the corridors and the dining room, and that created a visual chronicle of the family's history that connected the present generation to the past in a way that no other art form quite replicated. To walk down the staircase of a great Victorian house, past the portraits of successive generations, was to feel the weight of family continuity pressing on the present in a way that was simultaneously reassuring and constraining. The letters and diaries of the Victorian wealthy and what they reveal about private life, among the most valuable sources for understanding the inner life of the Victorian wealthy, are the private documents they left behind. the letters and diaries and journals in which they recorded their thoughts, feelings, observations, and experiences with a frankness and a particularity that the public performances of their social lives did not always allow. The Victorians were prodigious letter writers. The combination of the penny post and the multiple daily deliveries that the Victorian postal service provided in both urban and rural areas made letter writing a primary form of communication that served the functions now served by telephone and email and text message. Victorian letters are often long, detailed, and emotionally direct in ways that the formality of their social behaviour might lead us not to expect. A Victorian woman writing to her sister about her marriage, or to her closest friend about her children, or to her mother about her anxieties and her satisfactions, could be entirely candid in a way that the drawing room never permitted. The diary was another form of private expression that many Victorian men and women maintained with considerable regularity and detail. Victorian diaries record the daily texture of elite life with a specificity that no other source provides. The weather and the visitors and the meals and the letters received and sent, the health anxieties and the financial worries and the social pleasures and the private observations about the people encountered that the social performance of the period required to be kept strictly internal. Reading Victorian private correspondence and diaries is to encounter people who are both deeply familiar and strikingly different from ourselves. Familiar in their emotional range, their capacity for love and grief and humour and irritation. Different in the assumptions they bring to gender and class and religion and the proper order of things. The letters and diaries of the Victorian wealthy are the most intimate record of an intimate world, and they continue to be read and studied and published because they tell us things about the Victorian era that no official record and no public performance could have preserved. The Victorian wealthy and the question of what they believed about themselves. At the heart of the Victorian wealthy world was a set of beliefs about identity and obligation and destiny that its members had absorbed so completely that they rarely needed to articulate them explicitly. They believed that their position in society was natural and right. They believed that the wealth and the power they held came with obligations toward those who had less, and that those obligations, properly discharged, justified the inequality from which they benefited. They believed in the empire as a civilizing project that brought order and progress and Christianity to peoples who had not previously enjoyed those advantages. A belief that the subject peoples of the empire did not universally share, but that the Victorian wealthy held with genuine conviction rather than mere self-interest. They believed in the importance of character, of the particular combination of courage and self-control, and loyalty and stoicism that the public school and the regiment and the club were designed to produce, and that distinguished in their minds the true gentleman from the merely wealthy. They believed in progress, in the forward movement of civilization toward greater comfort and greater knowledge and greater power over nature that the Victorian era seemed so compellingly to demonstrate. And they believed, most of them, in God, though the confidence of that belief varied enormously and was, by the end of the period, more troubled than it had been at the beginning. These beliefs were not simply self-serving. Though they served the self, they were genuinely held convictions that shaped behavior and produced, alongside the injustice and the hypocrisy that a critical eye can easily find, real achievements of philanthropy and reform, and artistic patronage and scientific support that the world we live in continues to benefit from. The Victorian wealthy were complicated people. They lived in a complicated time. They did things we would recognize as admirable, and things we would recognize as indefensible, and many things that sit somewhere in between. Their world is gone, but it left behind houses and gardens and paintings and books, and the complicated legacy of an empire, and the social institutions that shaped the country that came after them. They are worth knowing. Not to admire uncritically, and not to condemn completely, but to understand, as fully and as honestly as we can. As people who lived a specific kind of life in a specific kind of time, and who shaped, for better and worse, the world we inherited from them.